Sometimes in history, the name of something can tell you exactly what it is and what you're getting into. Battleships evoke the sense of big guns and heavy armor. Submarines, the sense of lurking under the sea to strike when least expected. Fighters, soaring in the sky and engaging in aerial duels of legend. And, of course, bombers flattening anything that looks at them funny. So it is with the triplane, because when two wings are for chumps, accept no substitute. I feel fairly confident in saying that anyone watching this video has at least heard of a triplane. Most probably the famous red-painted one of one Manfred von Richthofen. The question of what a triplane is really is answered by the name. The question of why a triplane is the more interesting one to ask. Because triplanes are really good at one or two things, but also really bad at others. There's a reason that, while biplanes endured surprisingly long, triplanes more or less went out of style by the end of the Great War. If not sooner, a few stubborn pilots aside. The genesis of the triplane goes back shockingly far. There's at least one case of a glider triplane in the mid-19th century, but the planes only really saw widespread use and adoption in a very small period. That was the last 2 years of World War I, when technology was rapidly advancing, and all powers were looking for any advantage they could get on their enemies. The thing is, though, that even here it wasn't necessarily going to happen. The Germans weren't showing any interest in triplanes, and nor were the Austrians, or even the French or Russians. In fact, even the British didn't actually ask for a triplane when Sopwith's chief designer, Herbert Smith, decided, the pup is nice and all, but what if we gave it another wing? Which proceeded to kick off the triplane craze of 1917, when the resultant plane proved to be very good at its job as a scout fighter. To understand why, one has to understand the main advantage of a triplane. In simplest terms, if a biplane has more lift and maneuverability compared to a monoplane, a triplane, as a general rule, has even more in comparison to the biplane. Adding another wing, if designed well, adds on to the advantages of the biplane. If designed well, of course, because you can very easily mess up a triplane by not making it strong enough, or not making good wings, or putting a terrible layout of wings, or any number of things. The Sopwith triplane, when it came out, was about as close to ideal as any triplane fighter could hope to be. It even lacked in perhaps the greatest flaw of any triplane design, in that it wasn't particularly slow by the standards at the time. Actually pretty fast as these things go, though I am getting ahead of myself here. Right, when looking at a triplane, the first things to come to mind are narrow wings. By adding the third wing, you can make your wings narrower without sacrificing on lift. This is important because narrower wings help in visibility, which is one of the biggest complaints that Great War pilots had about both monoplanes and biplanes. Furthermore, you can increase the angle of attack on those wings, which is where the added maneuverability comes in. If you go a step further in that line of thinking, the added lift allows for a shorter plane, which turns even better than the third wing already lets it do. Second to the maneuverability, you have the increase in rate of climb. More lift equated to faster climbing rate, and, for that matter, a higher service ceiling as well. That is, for those who don't know what that means, the plane can fly higher than contemporary biplanes could. This increase in the maneuverability and rate of climb is why Great War pilots loved the triplane when it first came out. Because speed wasn't very important to them, but being able to outturn and outclimb your enemy very much was. That's why it's the two major advantages of a triplane compared to a biplane. There are other subsets to this too, like the extra lift of a triplane being good for a bomber to carry a heavier load to higher levels. Increased wing area on a bomber was very helpful in the days of weak and underpowered engines. That being said, triplane bombers aren't near as famous as triplane fighters, mostly thanks to the Red Baron. Which is where we'll return to the Sopwith triplane, since you can lay the later fame of the Fokker design entirely on the feet of the Sopwith model. Since Anthony Fokker was entirely uninterested in triplanes until he was pretty much forced into it. You see, in classic Great War fashion, the sudden introduction of the Sopwith triplane upended the balance on the front and started a scramble to counter it. There were never many of any type of triplane in service, and while this was true for the Sopwith, it had a very outsized impact when it arrived in service. A group of 5 Canadian pilots managed to down 86 enemy planes from the start of June to the end of July in 1917, for the loss of 3 of the 5, 2 of which were shot down by anti-aircraft fire, not enemy planes. All the more impressive considering the Sopwith triplane carried all of 1 machine gun. While at least partially down to the skill of these men, the agility of the Sopwith plane was nothing to sneeze at and very quickly got the attention of the Germans. Not least because those crazy Canadian lads, they were dealing losses to the best of the best in the Imperial German Air Force, the Red Barons unit. As one could probably expect, this had the same result as what I mentioned in the Albatross D3 video. In that case, the same as what the sesquiplane, which is 1.5 wings for those who don't watch it, Nieuports had done. The Germans were finding themselves outplayed by a new development on the Entente side, and promptly set about copying it in their own designs. Albatross literally took a D5, the then current German fighter, and slapped Sopwith-style triplane wings on it. That didn't go very far, as one could expect. Nor did the dozen or so other designs the Germans and Austrians put out between them. Many designers and companies tried their hands at this. German command had basically hit the panic button and went, triplane now. Remember though how I said Fokker was uninterested in triplanes until forced into it? That'd be where he comes into the picture. In spite of coming up with some nice biplane designs, the Germans really were quite interested in triplanes at this point. So in June of 1917, Fokker reluctantly modified one of his planes destined for Austria into the famous DR-1 triplane. This stubby little fighter would prove about as much a shock to the British as the Sopwith had been to the Germans when it entered service in August. There's a rather famous story, shown in the old Dogfights series, of Werner Voss dogfighting 7 SE-5s in his triplane, pulling some pretty ludicrous maneuvers all the while. Not that it kept him alive, though. However, by this point, no matter what German aces could do in it, the triplane craze was kind of fizzling out. The British were transitioning to the more conventional Sopwith Camel and SE-5. The other Entente powers had never really jumped on the train in the first place. And for all that pilots like Voss and von Richthofen would show how agile the Fokker bird was, it had its flaws. One of which it shared with the earlier Albatross D3 in having the top wing decide it really wanted to fly on its own, detaching from the rest of the plane with predictable results. As a direct result of that, the Fokker planes were grounded right when they were at their most effective. And while they would eventually return to service, no more than 300 of the DR-1 would ever be built. Why? Well, I alluded to this earlier. Remember that the Sopwith triplane was interesting in that it was actually pretty fast? You see, the thing about a triplane that Sopwith managed to avoid, more or less, through good design work, is that the extra wing and the bracing required for it made for quite a lot of extra drag. The lift was all well and good, but your average triplane is going to be slower than a biplane or monoplane, if everything else is equal about them. The Fokker DR-1 can only barely crack 100 miles per hour, 180-ish kilometers per hour, on a good day. It's all well and good to climb high and turn well, but if the enemy can just fly away without you being able to catch them, well, while the triplane is great in its element, it was quickly becoming apparent the enemy could deny them that element. Even Richthofen was likely going to switch to the new, and conventional, D7 biplane had he survived. While a couple triplane designs would crop up later, after that short year or so of dominance, the concept mostly faded away. Compare this to biplanes, which endured right up to the Second World War, in the case of hanger-ons, like the Gloucester Gladiator, or frontline planes, like the Italian Fiat models. Once speed became ever more important for a fighter plane, triplanes just couldn't keep up. Metaphorically, and very literally. Even for the extra lift on bombers or transports of the like, they were relegated to the dustbin of history fairly early on after the Great War ended. They had a famous moment in the spotlight before fading away in the face of more efficient designs. Still, no one will likely ever forget that red-painted Fokker so long as they study aviation history. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I hope you enjoy these experiments. See you in the next one.